Welcome, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for what might be one of the most unusual and multi-layered explorations we've ever undertaken here.
It certainly looks that way.
Our source stack for this deep dive is a singular, custom-blended dossier. It attempts to reconcile spiritual doctrine with some deeply skeptical sociopolitical critique and synthesized research, all focused on one incredibly sensitive topic: marital age disparity.
It is an extraordinary compilation, yeah.
Yeah.
Usually, we're looking at academic reports, maybe government papers, straightforward stuff.
Right.
But here, we're decoding a specific piece of Catholic apologetics, Index 2229, dated November 12th, 2025.
Right.
And it starts with this very focused theological question about canon law impediments regarding age.
Okay.
And then it just immediately explodes outward. It reviews everything from civil statutes and psychological developmental milestones to, well, radical ideological frameworks. It's quite the mix.
That's exactly the challenge. So our mission today is strictly forensic. We have to be clear about that. We are not here to endorse any specific viewpoint, especially given some of the highly charged language and the unique kind of adversarial lens of the original author. Our goal is simply to unpack and synthesize how these wildly different frameworks, legal statutes, therapeutic standards, traditional religious dogma, modern political ideologies, how they actually define, critique, and sometimes even structurally encourage age gaps in romantic partnerships.
Exactly. This isn't just reviewing data. It's analyzing competing definitions of reality in a way. The source forces us to confront multiple standards all at once. It's synthesizing everything from, ancient scriptural mandates and historical practices right through to modern therapeutic metrics and some doubly partisan political theory. And all of it is filtered through the specific ideological critique the original author applies.
And the spark, the initial catalyst for this whole deep dive, it's rooted very specifically in that theological setting.
It is.
The entire analysis seems driven by a need to provide a definitive, religiously sound answer to what they perceive as a social attack.
That's right. The author starts by framing their whole investigation as a question perspective article. It apparently came from a question on Christianity's Stack Exchange.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Can the church institute a marital age disparity limit impediment? But the author sees this question as symptomatic of a much larger, coordinated social engineering campaign. And that's really the necessary context for everything that follows in the document.
Okay, let's unpack this unusual framing because it really dictates how the source material chooses to analyze every single piece of data it looks at.
It really does.
The author is operating from a highly specific, almost adversarial worldview, arguing that the social landscape we all navigate is, well, essentially rigged.
Indeed. The author's premise, and we have to keep reminding ourselves, this is their specific and highly charged lens, is that there's a profound crisis of information control. They make this really strong assertion that corporate media naming specific platforms like YouTube, X, Google, Stack Exchange, even AI chatbots, along with powerful NGOs and institutional systems, medical, financial, legal bodies, that they near exclusively define the world's Overton window, the OW.
EOW, okay.
And they view this centralized control as exercising pervasive mind control on the masses. That's the term they use.
Wow, that's a powerful claim right there. Basically arguing that nearly all public standards, institutional norms, conventional wisdom, it's all centrally dictated and coordinated.
Pretty much.
An assertion that secular society has been corrupted from the top down.
Precisely. And they escalate this critique even further, linking this media and institutional control to a specific adversarial force they identify.
Okay.
The source specifically refers to SCOTUS, hyper-empowered Zionist, or other minions of Synagogue of Satan, Soft-Conduct-controlled corporations, as actively directing this political and social OW. Yes, Synagogue of Satan. They see this coordination, which they term the SOF-S, as controlling everything from federal and regional government policies to educational systems, professional certifications, the works.
Okay. Now, for you, the listener, it is absolutely crucial to understand this. We are only reporting on this specific, highly charged framework because the source author uses it to contextualize their entire investigation into age disparity.
Exactly.
We are not endorsing this specific perspective or this terminology at all, but it is the critical, foundational lens through which the data was collected, interpreted, and synthesized by the original author. We have to analyze this document forensically.
That's right. The author's main motivation for even doing this analysis seems to stem from a desire to transform what they call worldly sexual relationship details, the ones defined by the media and corporations, into concepts that align with Catholic theology, dogma, and divine revelation. They're seeking what they term a true, just right-ordered scriptural rod. So, the belief in this widespread corporate and institutional control is what justifies, in their view, the need for this deep theological and traditional discernment, essentially bypassing modern legal and psychological standards because they see them as tainted.
Right, because those standards come from the very institutions they distrust.
Correct.
So what makes age disparity such a hot-button issue within this specific framework? It started with that canon law question, but the author ties it to perceived historical precedents they believe are under attack.
They do. The author views this current line of questioning about age limits in canon law as potentially malicious. They suggest the sophists, as they term it, might use perceived historical precedents to pathologize and scandalize marriage disparity in the modern context.
How so?
The example they cite is the assumed, and they say exaggerated, historical age difference between St. Joseph and the Holy Virgin Mother Mary. The source mentions a tradition suggesting an age gap of possibly 70 years for Joseph and 14 for Mary.
Wow, 70 and 14.
Yeah, though the author is careful to note this is an unreferenced, assumed exaggerated age difference. But the point remains.
Wait, so the concern is that if the author's perceived adversaries, the sophists, can successfully argue that even historical holy marriages with wide age gaps are somehow pathological or immoral by today's standards.
Then they undermine the entire traditional structure of marriage.
Exactly. So the defense then has to establish a standard that is both rational and, in their view, pre-ideological, untainted.
Precisely. If the corporate and media Overton window is painted and can't be trusted, the author has to turn to an alternative, non-corporate source of wisdom to establish a clear numerical formula. And here's where they introduce their initial numerical proposal.
This is where we get to the famous, or maybe infamous, rule, half your age plus 7.
That go on.
The author cites this formula as a high-confidence source for defining relationship stability, but the origin story they give it is, well, it's truly remarkable.
It is quite something. They argue this wisdom came directly from their high school young women, peer friends, co-student life social members, lovers, and personal reflections.
From high school peers.
Yes. And the key factor for the author is that this standard was established and sampled before what they term the soft-esque contamination of extreme mind-raping, feminism, communism, or the most common, other demonic oppression forces.
Right.
So for the author, this formula is basically an unimpeachable standard. It's rooted in the sane and reasoned standards of, and this is their phrasing, above average, intelligent, fertile women gatekeepers who were defining acceptable courtship standards completely outside of any institutional pressure.
So we have a formula, which most people today probably know as just secular social guidance, maybe even a bit of a joke.
Right.
Being recast here as a sort of pre-fall natural law standard that predates modern ideological warfare. That's a fascinating inversion.
It really is.
Let's make sure we clearly explain the math of the half your age plus 7 rule for the listener, just so everyone's on the same page.
Sure. The rule dictates the minimum acceptable age for the younger partner in a relationship. You take the oldest person's age, you divide it by 2, and then you add 7 years.
Right.
The result is the minimum acceptable age for their partner. The idea is to avoid social stigma and, according to this source's original context, maximize things like relationship stability, parity in life wisdom, and even physical compatibility.
Let's ground this theory in reality for a moment. How does the half your age plus 7 rule actually play out numerically? Give us an example.
Certainly. So let's say the older person is 40 years old. You do the calculation. 40 divided by 2 equals 20. Then you add 7, and the result is 27.
27.
That means the younger person's age should be at least 27 years old. So a 40-year-old older person should ideally have a younger partner aged between 27 and 40.
And if the older person is, say, 60?
Okay, 60 divided by 2 is 30. Add 7, that's 37. So the minimum age for the younger partner jumps to 37.
That actually puts a surprisingly tight numerical constraint on age disparity, doesn't it? Much tighter than many people might just casually assume.
It really does. And the author sees this not just as social awkwardness avoidance, but as genuine wisdom related to life experience, physical compatibility, and, critically for them, social acceptance defined by women, untainted by institutional pressures.
It's highly significant because the author views this formula as reflecting natural law principles that existed before the current, what did they call it? Reality warping and insanity's acceptance.
That's the phrase they used, yes.
Yeah.
They characterize the modern state that way. So for them, this rule is their foundational pre-ideological threshold. It sets the bar much higher than merely legal consent.
Okay. Given that the author's ideological framework basically dismisses modern standards as tainted, here's where it gets really interesting. We now have to transition from this specific ideological and personal framework to the synthesized, data-driven frameworks that the author is forced to compare their standard against. We're talking about the legal, psychological, and social realms.
Exactly. We move from the theological and political context that frames the whole thing into the legal, social, and psychological standards, which are, ironically, often set by the very institutional systems the author critiques so harshly. It provides a really comprehensive contrast.
All right, let's start with the clearest boundaries, the ones recognized by the state, the legal standards and constraints. What does the source material actually say about the law, which is, at the end of the day, the only truly enforceable mechanism here?
Well, the primary legal concern is obviously the age of consent.
Right.
And this is highly variable. It ranges from 16 to 18 in most U.S. states, and globally it can shift between 14 and 18. Marriage minimums generally sit around 18, though some places allow 16 or 17 with parental consent.
But the key legal point for disparity is,
crucially, once both parties reach the age of majority, often 18, there's generally no upper legal limit on the age gap in civil law. A 90-year-old can legally marry an 18-year-old. The law doesn't step in there.
but the law does acknowledge disparity in certain situations, right? Which is where those Romeo and Juliet exceptions come in. They seem to address the difference between strict legality and maybe perceived maturity difference.
Precisely. These exceptions exist primarily to prevent the criminal prosecution, usually for statutory rape, of relationships where one partner is technically below the established age of consent, but the age gap between them is small, typically just 2 to 4 years.
Okay.
This acknowledges a kind of qualitative difference in the eyes of the law, implicitly anyway. A 17-year-old and a 19-year-old relationship is treated differently than a 17-year-old and a 40-year-old relationship, even if the 17-year-old is technically under the legal threshold in both cases.
So the law is trying to use the age gap itself as a proxy for potential coercion or exploitation in those statutory contexts.
You could say that, yes. It's an attempt to factor in the power disparity represented by age, but only in those very specific near-consent age situations.
So we have this tension in practical scrutiny, then. The source notes that a 40-year-old and an 18-year-old relationship is entirely legal.
Completely legal in most places.
But it faces massive social and, practical scrutiny, while a 19 and 17-year-old pairing might actually be technically illegal depending on the state law.
Depending on jurisdiction, yeah.
Even though the maturity difference seems minimal.
That's the core conflict, isn't it? The law focuses on that strict line of consent, which is a necessary tool, maybe a blunt one, but necessary. Society, though, applies scrutiny based on the disparity of experience, power, life stage, all those fuzzier things.
Which leads us directly back to the social and popular standards, the unwritten rules.
Exactly.
We introduced the half your age plus 7 rule earlier as part of the author's theological defense, but it definitely exists independently in secular culture. In that context, what is it primarily used for? What's its function?
Well, in modern secular usage, the rule functions almost exclusively as a standard for preventing social awkwardness or, attracting social stigma.
Just avoiding weird looks.
Pretty much. It's a gauge for whether a relationship will prompt awkward questions from your family, generate gossip among friends, or maybe look suspicious or off in a public setting. It's really less about morality these days and much more about managing external perception.
Okay. And what does the conventional wisdom, as synthesized in the source stack, tell us about the acceptable life stages? The gaps people generally accept without much comment.
The conventional wisdom seems to focus heavily on life stage matching.
Right.
Ideally, partners should be in roughly the same decade, say, both between 25 and 35 or both in their 40s. A 5-year gap is generally invisible. Nobody really notices or cares.
And a 10-year gap?
A 10-year gap is noticeable, sure, but it's common enough in dating pools, especially as people get older, that it doesn't usually cause much fuss. Think a 30-year-old and a 40-year-old, or a 45 and a 55. Pretty standard.
So where does society typically start to draw the line, where the disparity becomes really noticeable and attracts comment?
The threshold for comment, according to the synthesis, often begins when the gap hits 15 years or more.
15 years. Okay.
Yeah, that's the point where differences in cultural references become really apparent. Who remembers dial-up internet versus who grew up with smartphones? Who lived through the Cold War versus...
Completely different lived experiences.
Exactly. Career stages, personal histories. It all becomes unavoidable and noticeable to external observers. And if the younger partner is under 30, a 15-year gap often prompts immediate, sometimes negative, speculation about the power dynamics involved.
This scrutiny then brings us naturally into the psychological and developmental standards. This is the realm of clinical assessment, right? Less about law or stigma, more about genuine readiness, maturity, and parity in the relationship.
This is arguably the most objective framework we have based on developmental science. The primary psychological benchmark cited throughout the sources is the maturation of the prefrontal cortex, or PFC.
Okay, the PFC, remind us what that does.
That's the region of the brain responsible for all the high-level executive functions. Complex decision-making, long-term planning, assessing risk accurately, impulse control, understanding consequences, basically adult thinking.
And when is that considered fully developed?
It's generally considered fully developed around age 25. There's some individual variation, of course, but 25 is the widely accepted average milestone.
Why is that age 25 threshold so critical when we discuss potential age gaps in relationships?
Because the gaps become most concerning from a psychological standpoint when one partner is under 25 and the other is significantly older.
Because of the brain development difference?
Exactly. You have a fully mature, established individual PFC, fully online, maybe career trajectory set, robust life experience paired with someone who is neurologically still complete in their development. The power dynamics inevitably skew heavily, just based on cognitive capacity.
Can you give an example of how that plays out?
Sure. The younger person, under 25, may literally lack the full neurological capacity for accurate long-term planning or risk assessment. This makes them potentially vulnerable to financial decisions or life path choices pushed by the older partner, choices they might not be able to fully foresee the consequences of. They might also exhibit increased emotional volatility or be more susceptible to manipulative behaviors like gaslighting within that kind of high asymmetry relationship, simply because their own judgment and self-perception are still solidifying.
So the concern isn't just the number of years apart, but the fundamental disparity in their ability to negotiate freely and equally based on brain development.
Absolutely. It's about developmental parity. And the sources identify 4 key red flags that signal potential risk and predatory patterns in any age gap relationship, regardless of strict legality or adherence to the +7 rule. We should probably go into detail on these, as they represent a kind of clinical consensus distilled in the source.
Okay, let's do that. Let's start with the first red flag, pattern behavior. What does that mean?
This is when an older partner specifically and repeatedly seeks out partners who are much younger than themselves. Not just once, but as a consistent pattern over time.
Why is that a red flag for, say, a therapist?
Because it suggests a persistent preference for unequal dynamics. The concern is that the older partner may be drawn, consciously or unconsciously, to the lack of experience, the ease of impressing, or the reduced negotiation skill of a much younger person, rather than seeking an adult peer relationship on equal footing.
Got it. What about financial or social disparity? That's the second flag.
Right. A significant disparity in income, career status, or social capital, when combined with a notable age gap, is highly concerning.
Because money is power.
Essentially, yes. The older partner often holds powerful financial leverage. The younger partner's consent to be in the relationship might be genuine, but their ability to negotiate within it freely, or crucially, their ability to leave freely without facing severe economic repercussions or instability, can be seriously compromised. This disparity can fundamentally undermine parity and equality.
Okay. The third and fourth flags concern the social world of the younger partner, isolation, and pacing.
Isolation is a massive indicator of risk across many types of potentially unhealthy relationships, not just age gap ones.
How does it apply here?
If the older partner deliberately, or even subtly, separates the younger partner from their own peer group, their family, or their existing support network, it's a huge red flag.
Why?
Because it prevents the younger person from receiving external reality checks, different perspectives, and emotional support outside the relationship bubble. It makes them entirely dependent on the older partner's narrative and interpretation of events.
And the fourth flag was rushed commitment.
Yes, pushing for marriage, cohabitation, joint finances, or having children too quickly, especially when the younger partner is under 25.
And the reasoning there?
It prevents the younger partner, whose brain is still developing and who lacks comparative life experience, from fully processing the gravity, the long-term implications, and the potential pitfalls of the relationship dynamics before making life-altering commitments. It bypasses their developing judgment.
So if those red flags are avoided, no predatory pattern, no huge enforced dependency, no isolation, reasonable pacing, what constitutes an acceptable psychological framework for age gaps, particularly once both partners are fully mature adults.
Well, the acceptable framework seems to be that life stage matching matters much more than the absolute number of years once both partners have reached full adulthood, generally post-mid-20s.
So the number itself becomes less critical later on.
It seems so.
Yeah.
A 55-year-old and a 70-year-old have a 15-year gap, right, which sounds large. But both are likely established mature adults, possibly sharing similar perspectives on things like retirement, mortality, legacy, or grandparenthood. This generally presents fewer fundamental psychological challenges related to power and development than, say, the 25-year-old and 40-year-old pairing, where life trajectories, goals, and daily concerns are often vastly divergent.
Okay, that makes sense. That transition from legality and psychological standards brings us squarely back into the ideological realm now, where the focus shifts entirely to power, class, and the role of broader social structures in determining what's acceptable or problematic about age gaps.
Exactly. We've established the standards of biological maturity, legal lines, and psychological red flags. Now we look at how different political and social philosophies critique age disparity as a matter of systemic inequality, or, conversely, as a functional necessity.
Let's begin with feminist perspectives. These inherently approach this subject through the lens of power imbalance and social structure, don't they?
Absolutely. Power is central.
We need to understand the fundamental difference the source outlines between liberal and radical feminism on age gaps. How does liberal feminism view it?
Liberal feminism tends to ground its analysis in individual choice and consent. From this perspective, an age gap isn't inherently wrong if both partners are autonomous adults and genuinely capable of negotiating the terms of their relationship freely.
So the critique centers on factors that undermine that free choice.
Exactly. The critique focuses on coercion, whether it's financial dependence, emotional manipulation, or other structural factors that limit the younger partner's, usually the woman's, ability to negotiate as an equal, or to leave the relationship without significant penalty. They are often highly critical of the standard older, many younger woman pattern.
Why specifically that pattern?
Because it so often mirrors and reinforces established patriarchal dynamics in economic realities, where male age correlates with increased resources and status, potentially creating an uneven playing field from the start. It suggests a structural advantage is at play.
But liberal feminists, according to the source, often view the older woman, younger man pattern, the so-called cougar dynamic, through a different lens, maybe seeing it as potentially empowering.
That's often the case, yes. They might interpret the older woman, younger man relationship as transgressive in a positive way, as a challenge to the status quo. Well, it subverts the typical patriarchal expectation that men must always be the older, richer, more established partner, and it challenges the pervasive idea that female sexual desirability has an early expiration date tied to youth and fertility.
So it can be seen as reclaiming agency?
It can be seen as an act of reclaiming female sexual agency outside of the traditional reproductive contract, or the expectation that women must trade up economically in partnership. It's about her choice and desire taking center stage.
Okay. Radical feminism, however, takes a much harder, more structural line against large age gaps, particularly the traditional male older pattern. The source says they question the very possibility of true consent within that power imbalance.
That's correct. Radical feminism tends to view large gaps, especially those over 15 years where the woman is under 25, as inherently problematic precisely because of the context of entrenched patriarchy.
They don't believe the choice can be truly free.
They are deeply skeptical. They often see the pattern of men over 35 seeking women under 25, not just as individual preference, but as serving a male structural need or entitlement.
What's the specific rationale laid out in the source for that view? How is the choice seen as manufactured?
It's interpreted primarily as systemic male access to female youth and fertility. Older male status and resources are effectively exchanged for young female beauty and reproductive capacity.
So it's a systemic transaction.
From their perspective, yes. They scrutinize the validity of choice itself, arguing that a young woman's options and desires are always constrained and shaped by the existing patriarchal context, which heavily valorizes young female beauty and makes older male status and stability a powerful currency. Therefore, the choice for a young woman to enter such a relationship may not be entirely freely chosen, but strategically manufactured or heavily incentivized by systemic pressures and limited alternatives.
A much more deterministic view. Now, moving to the Marxist-communist framework described in the source, the focus shifts entirely again. It's not about patriarchy or individual choice primarily, but about material conditions and class relations.
Exactly. For Marxism, the economic base is key. Classically, Marxist analysis looked at marriage itself as fundamentally an economic unit, and age gaps often reflected property consolidation and class dynamics within that.
How did that work historically?
The older men, younger woman pattern was historically linked to the control of assets, land, and inheritance. The marriage was often an explicit economic arrangement, where the man used his established wealth as capital to acquire a young, fertile wife who represented reproductive labor capacity and lineage continuation. Dowry systems also often created age asymmetry.
Okay, that makes sense historically. How do contemporary leftist views, as outlined in the source, apply this kind of analysis to modern, seemingly voluntary relationships with age gaps?
They tend to focus heavily on the economic power dynamics in the modern context. They might view relationships like the sugar daddy dynamic, for example, as quasi-transactional, arguing it reflects the commodification of youth under late capitalism.
Commodification.
Yeah. Age is highly correlated with accumulated wealth, income stability, and established resources. This leads to the suspicion that significant age gaps reflect the exchange value of youth and beauty being traded for the use value of economic stability and access to resources. The core suspicion is that capitalism inherently creates and exploits the material asymmetries that make these unequal relationships appealing or even necessary for some.
And their ideal state, from this perspective, remains constant, regardless of how they analyze the gap itself.
Yes. The ideal state, from a Marxist or socialist perspective, would be one of genuine economic and social equality between partners, regardless of age. If both partners are equally empowered economically, the critique of the age gap, which is often rooted in analyzing that material asymmetry, diminishes significantly. The focus is on eliminating the economic disparity that might drive the age gap relationship.
All right. Next, we have the patriarchal traditional standards. Now, these are explicitly prescriptive about the age gap, aren't they? The source presents them not as a potential problem, but almost as an optimization strategy for a specific kind of family structure.
That's a good way to put it. These standards are strictly rooted in clearly defined gender roles and perceived biological utility within a hierarchical family unit. The core principle is the older man functioning as the provider, protector, and established leader,
Okay.
paired with the younger woman fulfilling the roles of childbearer, homemaker, and often explicitly the source of beauty and domestic harmony.
And what specific age windows did these traditional frameworks prioritize for this optimized pairing?
They tended to prioritize the male peak in terms of status, resource accumulation, wisdom, and social establishment occurring somewhere in his 30s and 40s.
Right.
Conversely, the female peak, defined primarily by peak fertility, adaptability to the husband's household, and perceived physical beauty, was typically prioritized between the ages of 18 and 25.
So the ideal gap emerges naturally from those peaks.
Exactly. Therefore, the typical endorsed gap was often somewhere between 5 and 15 years, with an older husband considered ideal. This structure was believed to ensure the man was fully established, mature, and prepared to lead the family before marriage, maximizing stability and continuity.
And the source material cites specific precedents for this logic, beyond just general tradition.
Absolutely. Beyond citing biblical patriarchs like the example given of Abraham being about 10 years older than Sarah, suggesting an older male precedent, they point to historical practices among nobility and royal families, where 10 to 20-year gaps were quite common and strategically employed.
Why strategically?
The structural logic dictated that the man's peak status window needed to overlap maximally with the woman's peak fertility window to ensure the production of heirs, the consolidation of property, and overall social stability for the lineage. It was functional.
Okay. Conversely, we have the matriarchal or matrifocal perspectives described. How do they view age disparity, especially when the woman is the older partner?
Well, this perspective fundamentally emphasizes women's sexual and reproductive autonomy and actively challenges the traditional power hierarchy, where the man is expected to be older and dominant.
So it flips the script.
Essentially. While historical matriarchies are complex and debated, contemporary matrifocal thought as presented in the source, tends to validate women's relationship choices, especially those that defy the patriarchal standard of male age seniority.
And in the contemporary context, this is framed as a celebration of female agency.
Precisely. Contemporary matrifocal feminism, or perspectives aligned with it, often validates the older woman-younger man relationship pattern. This is frequently framed as actively challenging the perceived social and biological expiration date imposed on female desirability and sexual viability.
So it's a form of resistance.
You can see it that way. If a woman of 45 chooses a partner of 30, it's interpreted by some within this framework as a statement that her agency, her desires, and her sexual vitality are independent of traditional male approval, resource accumulation dynamics, or the need to conform to the older man provider model. The core idea here is that the woman's choice is paramount, and there's often deep skepticism towards relationships that conform too closely to the traditional older man patriarchal patterns.
This detailed review of these critical and ideological critiques now transitions us perfectly back to the foundational religious texts that actually inspired this whole deep dive in the first place. The traditional Catholic prescriptions, which, as described in the source, seem to elevate the age gap to an almost supportive structural element for the prescribed marital roles.
Indeed. We shift now from social critique and ideological debate back to a framework concerned with mandated spiritual and functional roles within marriage, where age disparity, particularly male seniority, is often seen as a feature, not a bug.
Okay, let's start by establishing the broader Catholic standards on age, both historical and contemporary, just for context. Then we can drill down into these specific, highly detailed roles the source prescribes, which seem much stricter than just modern canon law minimums.
Good idea. Historically, within Catholic cultures, 5 to 10-year gaps with an older husband were pretty standard. This often reflected the socioeconomic reality that the man needed time to become established enough to support a family.
Right.
Women typically married in their late teens or early 20s, men often in their mid-20s or even 30s. Now, current canon law technically still maintains the ancient minimum ages for marriage, 16 for a man, 14 for a woman.
Still 14. Wow.
Technically, yes, though civil law almost always overrides these minimums in practice today. You can't legally marry at 14 in most places.
Of course.
The focus in the modern church generally is more on the psychological and spiritual maturity and readiness of the couple for a lifelong commitment. There's no explicit upper limit on age gaps in canon law, but prudence and discernment regarding the gap are certainly encouraged.
The source material we're looking at, however, moves far beyond those modern minimums and general discernment, doesn't it? It prescribes very specific age factors based on its own internal logic about functional maturity, stability, and especially how age relates to the husband's required leadership role.
Correct. The author asserts quite strongly that due to what they term the widespread sin of Eve's poisons permeating the modern world, the husband's age is structurally better when it is noticeably greater than the wife's age.
Noticeably greater.
Yes. And they propose 2 specific neurological and physical age thresholds designed explicitly to ensure that the most mature person in the relationship who they mandate must be the husband, if possible, is the one taking the lead role.
Okay, what are those specific age prescriptions tied to maturity?
First, they state the husband's age should ideally be at or over 25.
Reflecting the PFC development we talked about.
Exactly. This reflects the age of full prefrontal cortex maturity, ensuring the designated leader possesses, theoretically, the full capacity for rational planning, sound judgment, and complex decision-making needed for headship.
And the second threshold.
Second, the wife's age being 21 or over is only considered significantly prescribed if she happens to be the oldest person in the marriage.
Why that specific condition?
The explicit rationale given is that the most mature person in the relationship will inevitably act as the leading reference for the less mature partner. So, to minimize mutual instability and ensure the relationship maintains the desired hierarchical order, husband leading, it's structurally preferable for the husband to be the older, more mature one over 25, guiding a younger wife. If the wife must be older, she should at least be over 21.
So it's about maintaining that specific order through age difference.
That seems to be the core logic presented, yes. Ensuring the designated leader has the developmental advantage.
And they also maintain that lower threshold related to physical development, the puberty one.
Yes, the puberty threshold. The source states both partners should be at least 15 years old or older.
And the reason?
The reasoning given is to ensure they are deep into the puberty changes and have acquired some basic experience with the sexually related physical, mental, and social transformational changes that accompany adolescence. The author sees this minimum level of sexual development and social acclimation as a necessary prerequisite for competently fulfilling the duties and understanding the nature of the marital vocation described.
Okay. Now we arrive at the absolute core of the traditional prescription detailed in this source. The 8 mandated roles within the marriage. Let's start with the husband, defined extensively as the head of the household, the authority model.
This role, as presented, is based entirely and explicitly on the authority model of Christ's leadership over the church, with the source directly citing Ephesians 5.23.
So it's a theological model.
Absolutely. The husband's governance is defined not as mere preference, but as a sacred duty. It's oriented toward the family's ultimate spiritual and material well-being, but crucially, it must be exercised with love, wisdom, and self-sacrifice, not tyranny. This structural requirement of headship is presented as the primary reason why his seniority in age and maturity is preferable, even necessary.
Let's detail the specific prescribed duties of the husband, starting with his role as the spiritual leader. What does that entail according to the source?
His duty is to be the primary engine and guide for the family's spiritual life, and it's highly specific and practical in the description.
How so?
He is responsible for initiating and leading daily family prayers. This must include, at minimum, the morning offering and grace before meals. Crucially, the source mandates his personal responsibility for leading the evening rosary.
The rosary specifically.
Yes. He must also ensure the family's strict adherence to traditional Catholic observances, such as obligatory Sunday Mass attendance and the proper observance of Lenten practices, fasting, abstinence, etc. The overall spiritual trajectory and health of the family rests squarely on his leadership, according to this view.
Okay. Then there are the material duties, the role of provider and protector, which sounds like an absolute mandate in this text.
It is presented as a strict traditional standard, yes. It is described as his sacred duty to be the sole breadwinner.
Sole breadwinner.
Yes. He must earn and provide all material necessities, food, shelter, clothing, education, healthcare, sufficient to ensure that his wife and children should not need to work outside the home.
So it goes beyond just providing.
It seems so.
Yeah.
It's about eliminating the necessity for them to seek outside employment, thereby preserving, in this view, the wife's ability to focus entirely on her domestic and maternal duties within the home. He's also charged, naturally, with protecting the family from both physical danger and external moral or spiritual corruption.
And the final authority structure, the role of governor and final authority, how is that exercised in practical terms?
The source states, the husband must have the final, non-negotiable say in all significant family decisions.
All of them.
All significant ones.
Ah.
This explicitly includes major financial allocations, how money is spent or saved, decisions about residence where the family lives, and the establishment and enforcement of household rules and standards. The source is clear that while he should consult with his wife and value her input, he remains the ultimate governor and must be willing to make the final, decisive judgment.
And the age gap supports this.
The implication is that his superior maturity and experience, ideally bolstered by the age gap, equips him to provide this reasoned, stable final judgment for the family's good.
And the final duty listed for the husband in this framework.
A disciplinarian.
Yeah.
He holds a primary responsibility for the discipline of the children.
Primary responsibility.
Yes. The source makes the specific point that this applies especially to the formation of sons, teaching them virtue, manly character, obedience to authority, and respect for the hierarchical order of the family and society. His leadership and discipline provides the foundational structure and order for what the source refers to as the domestic church.
Okay. If the husband is the head and governor, the wife is defined as the heart of the home. Her role completes and vivifies this order, but through what the source calls the submission model.
That's the framework presented. She is explicitly recognized as equal in dignity before God, created in his image. However, the source just as explicitly states she is subordinate in function and authority within the marriage structure.
How is that subordination modeled?
It's modeled directly on the church's loving submission to Christ. Her role is primarily internal, focused on the domestic sphere, managing the household, nurturing the children, supporting her husband. Her domain is the home, which she manages as its queen, but explicitly under her husband's ultimate headship.
Let's detail her specific duties as laid out, starting with submission and obedience. This is often a point of major contention or misunderstanding. How does the source define it?
The source defines this as an ordered and willing subordination to her husband's authority. The absolutely critical nuance, which is emphasized, is that this obedience is demanded only in all things not sinful.
Ah, so there's a limit.
A crucial limit. She cannot and must not obey any command from her husband that violates divine law or natural law. Her ultimate allegiance is to God. Within that boundary, however, her submission is viewed not as demeaning servitude, but as a virtuous act of love, trust, and cooperation with the divinely established order, which enables the stable governance and harmony of the family.
Okay. Then there is the role of motherhood and child rearing, which the source describes as her supreme vocation.
Yes, motherhood is described in the text as the primary and essential purpose of woman's existence within this traditional framework. This encompasses not just childbearing, but the exhaustive day-to-day care and upbringing of the young.
What does that care entail?
Her responsibility includes all the physical care, naturally, but critically, also the early religious and moral education of all the children. The source adds a specific note about her having a special focus on training her daughters in domestic virtues, piety, and preparation for their future roles as wives and mothers within this same model. This is seen as forming the soul of the home.
Her domestic role is also highly specific. Domestic management. How is that defined?
As the queen of the home, she is responsible for managing all aspects of the domestic labor.
All of it.
The cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, the organizing, the mending, and specifically managing the household budget on a daily or weekly basis to meet the family's needs, although this budget management remains under the husband's final financial oversight and authority. Her explicit job is to transform the physical house into a peaceful, orderly, and holy sanctuary that nurtures the family's spiritual and physical life.
And the final duty listed for the wife is perhaps the most explicit regarding the physical relationship, rendering the marriage debt which is tied directly to procreation.
Yes, this is defined within the traditional moral theology cited by the source as an obligation of justice and mutual self-giving inherent to the marriage contract. It technically applies to both partners, but the source here focuses on the woman's obligation to be sexually available to her husband for the marital act.
And the basis for this?
It cites 1 Corinthians 7.4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does.
To confirm the lack of absolute autonomy over one's own body within the context of the marital bond. Furthermore, it stresses that every marital act must remain open to procreation, reflecting the primary end of marriage in this view.
So synthesizing these incredibly detailed functional roles the provider had, the governor head, the submissive heart, the queenly manager, the mother, and connecting them back to age disparity, what is the author's ultimate conclusion about the necessity or desirability of a gap? The unambiguous conclusion presented in the source is that the husband's age is structurally better when it is noticeably greater than the wife's age, explicitly favoring a larger rather than a smaller age gap where the man is older.
Right, better.
Because this age gap provides inherent structural support for what the author calls the natural law and traditional Catholic standard true, just, right-ordered marital state. It helps ensure, through perceived natural development, the husband's superior maturity, establishment, and life experience, enabling him to more effectively lead, provide for, and govern the domestic church according to these very strict definitions of authority and submission. The age gap facilitates the prescribed roles.
That is an incredibly detailed and prescriptive framework. It really moves age disparity from being just a matter of personal preference or social convention to being almost a matter of functional necessity, tightly bound to specific theological duties and roles.
Absolutely.
It certainly sets up a radical contrast with the modern therapeutic and cultural standards we need to analyze next.
Precisely. We now transition one final time to see how the modern world, specifically through therapeutic and broader cultural lenses, deals with the reality of these age gaps when divine prescription and mandated patriarchal roles are set aside, focusing instead on psychological health, mutual consent, and lived experience.
Okay, let's examine the therapeutic and counseling standards now. This framework, as presented in the source's synthesis, seems less concerned with moral prescription or divine order, and much more concerned with function, potential pathology, and whether the age gap itself introduces inherent unmanageable risks to the partner's psychological well-being.
That's the general approach, yes. Functionality and safety.
What are the key benchmarks for assessment within this therapeutic lens?
Well, the therapeutic benchmark really reinforces what we saw emerging in the psychological standards section earlier. Large age gaps are considered far less inherently concerning when both partners are fully adult, typically meaning age 25 or older.
Once the brain development piece is settled.
Right. Once both individuals possess that full cognitive maturity and have more established identities, the focus shifts away from the numerical difference itself and onto the observable behavioral patterns and the functional health of the relationship dynamic.
And the assessment factors used by therapists are crucial for identifying genuine issues versus just a simple age difference on paper. Let's quickly revisit those 4 key factors mentioned earlier that signal risk, as they are central to this therapeutic view.
Definitely. First is the meeting history. Therapists will almost always ask, how and when did you meet?
Why is that so important?
If the relationship began or the initial grooming occurred when the younger partner was underage, even if they only became romantically involved after the age of consent, it remains a significant red flag. The power dynamic was established during a period of legal and neurological incapacity for the younger person, and that initial imbalance often persists.
Okay. The second factor was the pattern of seeking specific types of partners.
Right. Does the older partner have a consistent, documented history of exclusively seeking partners who are significantly younger than themselves, say, always 10, 15, or even 20 years younger, even as they themselves continue to age?
And that pattern suggests...
The patterns suggest a sustained preference for relationships where the older partner inherently holds the structural power advantage due to age and experience. It might indicate an avoidance of, or perhaps an inability to maintain, relationships with adult peers on a more equal footing.
Got it. The third factor is critical: the ability of the younger partner to leave freely.
This goes way beyond just legal consent to be in the relationship. The therapist assesses the actual practical, economic, and social dependence. Meaning, if the younger partner realistically cannot leave the relationship without facing severe financial collapse, homelessness, loss of their social network, or complete social severance, perhaps because the older partner controls everything, then the relationship operates under a degree of duress. Genuine negotiation or expressing dissent becomes effectively impossible, regardless of stated consent. This is where extreme wealth disparity combined with age gap becomes highly toxic.
Makes sense. And finally, peer isolation.
Yes. Counselors check carefully to ensure the younger partner maintains robust, independent, external relationships with their own peer group, supportive family members, mentors, etc.
And if they don't have those?
If the older partner has successfully isolated the younger person from these external support systems and perspectives, it creates a powerful control mechanism. It's inherently risky and often signals emotional abuse or manipulation is occurring, regardless of the specific age gap size. Isolation is a classic control tactic.
So, if those significant red flags are cleared, no grooming history, no pattern of predation, genuine ability to leave, no isolation, reasonable pacing, what are the generally accepted age gaps within pragmatic therapeutic practice, according to the synthesis?
Well, the clinical consensus described leans toward pragmatism and the importance of shared experience or life stage. Generally, a 10-year gap is seen as manageable when both partners are over 30.
Why over 30?
Because by then, both are typically in similar phases of career consolidation, perhaps family planning or raising young children or dealing with mortgages. Their daily realities have some overlap. Similarly, a 5-year gap is considered pretty unremarkable and acceptable when both partners are over 25, as both are considered fully adult.
So the therapeutic goal is more about shared ability to navigate life.
It seems so. Shared ability to navigate life challenges effectively as partners, which often correlates with a smaller disparity in life exposure and developmental stage, especially when younger.
We should probably briefly touch on religious and cultural variations outside of the very specific traditional Catholic source text we've focused on, just to acknowledge how other major traditions manage this complexity.
Absolutely. The source synthesis does briefly mention others. For instance, in Islamic perspectives, there's a strong emphasis on kafa, which means compatibility or suitability. Yes. And that encompasses factors like piety, social status, character, and sometimes age matching, though not always strictly. While the historical precedent of the Prophet Muhammad marrying Aisha with what's believed to be an approximate 25-year age difference is a complex and sometimes controversial topic within Islam.
Right.
Modern Islamic practice often emphasizes the mutual maturity, understanding, and compatibility needed for stable family building, regardless of the specific gap within legal and moral bounds.
And looking elsewhere, maybe globally, in the East.
Hindu traditions, historically, often favored significant age gaps, with older established men marrying young, sometimes teenage girls. This was often rooted in socioeconomic structures, caste considerations, and property arrangements.
But that's changed.
Significantly. Modern urban Hindu practice is increasingly egalitarian, reflecting global trends toward individual choice, female education, and companionate marriage. So age gaps are less common or extreme. though still present. Jewish perspectives are also mentioned. While Talmudic discussions exist on age and marriage, modern practice generally prefers similar ages for optimal shared life experience and community integration, but certainly accepts gaps when based on mutual respect and commitment.
We mentioned cohort concerns earlier, the different cultural references. Let's go a little deeper into the practical day-to-day challenges of those generational and cultural reference points that a really wide gap can create.
It's a real factor. A 20-year gap, for instance, means partners grew up in fundamentally different cultural eras. They literally experienced different technological landscapes, different defining historical events, different social norms growing up.
Examples.
They will likely have vastly different default reference points for music, movies, significant news events, political consensus shifts, communication styles, even humor sometimes. Think about the difference between someone whose formative years were shaped by the Cold War versus someone shaped by 9/11 and the rise of social media.
Right, very different worlds.
A 50-year-old partner who started their career without email or the internet has a fundamentally different ingrained approach to work, information access, and maybe even work-life balance than a 30-year-old who grew up entirely digital. This difference isn't necessarily bad, but it can be a source of constant low-grade friction, misunderstanding, or just a feeling of disconnect.
And what about the implicit power dynamic caused just by sheer life experience, even when both partners are mature adults, say 40 and 60?
That is significant and often underestimated. The older partner inevitably knows how the world works in a way the younger one simply doesn't yet. This covers everything from navigating complex bureaucracies, understanding financial markets, investing, dealing with homeownership, even just possessing a healthy skepticism bored of experience.
And this can be good or bad.
It can be viewed benignly as healthy mentorship, where wisdom, guidance, and practical help are generously shared. That can be wonderful. However, this inherent asymmetry of experience is also easily weaponized.
How so?
If the older partner uses their superior experience to consistently dismiss the younger partner's perspectives, invalidate their feelings, you'll understand when you're older, control access to information, or make unilateral decisions because they know best, then that mentorship quickly sours into manipulation and condescension. The experience gap becomes a tool of control.
Okay. Let's address the statistical and social reality that the source synthesis points out the profound gender asymmetries that dominate how age disparity actually manifests in the real world.
This is pretty stark. Statistically, the older, many younger woman pattern accounts for something like 85–90% of all heterosexual age gap relationships globally, where the gap is significant, say 10+ years.
90%?
Yeah, it's overwhelming. This huge asymmetry strongly suggests the pattern is driven by deep-seated, powerful social, economic, or perhaps even biological incentives, things like resource accumulation correlating with male age, and peak reproductive timeliness correlating with female youth, as the traditional model suggested.
What about same-sex couples?
Same-sex couples tend to show less rigid age patterns. Age gaps certainly exist, but the strong skew towards one specific pattern, like older, many younger woman, isn't usually replicated to the same degree. However, they are not entirely immune to age-related power dynamics concerns, especially regarding differences in career stage, income, or social status that might correlate with age.
And how does society react differently to the two main gender patterns of age gaps? The source mentions labeling.
The social response is highly gendered. The older, many younger woman relationship is significantly normalized in society, especially up to about a 15-year gap. It's often viewed, implicitly or explicitly, as reflecting male success, status, and virility.
But the reverse isn't true.
Not nearly to the same extent. The older woman-younger man relationship is frequently labeled with terms like the cougar phenomenon. It's often viewed as transgressive, slightly embarrassing, or even predatory in its own way.
Why the difference in reaction?
It highlights how social acceptance is deeply tied to which gender's power or preference is being expressed. If the woman is the senior partner, the relationship challenges traditional scripts about male leadership and female youth being the primary desirable trait. It's often scrutinized more harshly, sometimes framed as unnatural, desperate, or questioning the man's maturity or motives, in a way that the reverse pairing rarely faces with the same intensity.
This brings us to the moment of synthesis, the aha moment, perhaps, for you, the listener. If we throw all these diverse frameworks, theological mandates, legal minimums, psychological red flags, Marxist critiques, feminist power analyses, traditional role expectations into a big blender, where do they consistently converge on the core issue of age disparity? What's the common thread?
It's fascinating, really. They converge consistently on the idea that the specific numerical gap, the number of years itself, is ultimately far less important than the pattern of behavior involved and the structural power dynamics that the age gap either creates or exacerbates.
So it's not the number, it's the context and the behavior.
Exactly. The most consistent concern across nearly all these wildly different frameworks, even the traditionalist one, which demands that authority be wielded justly and not tyrannically, is the presence of predatory patterns, exploitation, and significant power imbalances that prevent genuine, mutual, respectful, and equal partnership negotiation. That's the common enemy, regardless of ideology.
So if we strip away the specific ideological arguments and the bare minimum of the law, can we define specific red zones where the risk of those negative dynamics is universally highest based on this synthesis?
Yes. Based on the convergence points in the synthesized source material, there seem to be 3 specific zones of high concern identified by clinical data, sociological observation, and even implicitly by the critiques.
Okay, what's the first red zone?
First, when the younger partner is under the age of 25 AND, the age gap simultaneously exceeds 10 years. This combination directly hits that crucial developmental maturity threshold we discussed, raising strong suspicions that the older partner might be specifically seeking an unequal negotiating position based on the younger partner's incomplete neurological development and lack of life experience.
Okay, under 25 and over 10 years apart, what's the second red zone?
Second, when the age gap exceeds 20 years, regardless of the partner's absolute ages, unless perhaps both are very elderly.
Why 20 years even if both are mature?
Because a gap that large inevitably creates extreme cultural, life stage, and cohort mismatches. These profound differences in lived experience frequently lead to friction, communication breakdowns, and often a knowledge and experience imbalance so vast that it becomes an almost insurmountable power imbalance, even if unintended. Shared reality becomes very difficult.
Makes sense. And the third red zone?
And third, whenever there are multiple reinforcing power disparities operating simultaneously. So, not just age, but age combined with extreme wealth disparity, plus significant status disparity, example, boss-employee, professor-student initially, plus a vast difference in relevant life experience. When these multiple asymmetries stack up, they create an environment where the younger, less powerful partner's autonomy and ability to freely consent or negotiate is severely compromised, almost by definition.
Okay, those are the clear danger zones. Conversely, where are the generally acceptable zones, where most frameworks, even the critical ones focusing on power, would likely back off their most intense scrutiny?
The synthesis suggests general acceptance, or at least reduced concern, primarily in these scenarios.
Okay.
1, when both partners are clearly over 30 years old and the age gap is under 10 years. Here, both are considered mature adults, likely past the most volatile early career and identity formation phases, increasing the chance of parity.
Right.
Second, 2, when both partners are over 40 years old and the gap is under 15 years. While a 15-year gap is substantial, when both partners are well into established adulthood, the power dynamic related purely to developmental maturity is less of a concern, though the cohort differences remain.
And the third acceptable zone?
And 3, perhaps most importantly, whenever the partners can demonstrably show they are in genuinely similar life stages, regardless of the absolute numerical gap. This could mean they are both retired, both established mid-career professionals, both empty nesters, or both parents of adult children. If their daily lives, goals, and challenges align, and they can genuinely demonstrate mutual respect, shared decision-making, and an egalitarian power balance within the relationship, the age gap itself becomes less relevant to external assessment.
What really stands out here after looking at all this is how the legal framework merely sets the absolute floor, the bare minimum line of consent, usually age 18.
Just baseline.
But beyond that, the social, psychological, and ideological frameworks apply these incredibly complex, nuanced layers of scrutiny focused on fairness, maturity, developmental capacity, economic power, social roles, and structural influence. It's vastly more complicated than just asking, is it legal?
It's a spectacular demonstration, isn't it? It shows how age, in the context of relationships, is never just a number. It functions as a potent proxy for all these different critical dimensions of human life. Financial capital, social status, reproductive potential, neurological maturity, life experience, depending entirely on the specific framework you choose to apply when analyzing it. #outro.
Well, we have completed our really fascinating and, I think, quite complex journey today. We started from a very specific, unusual place, a Catholic Apologetics journal, trying to define the moral and structural parameters of age disparity from its unique viewpoint.
Right, a very particular starting point.
And we ended up in this detailed synthesis of therapeutic guidelines, sociological observations, and competing ideological standards from across the spectrum.
The contrast throughout has been striking, hasn't it?
Mm.
We moved from systems that demand specific numerical rules, like the author's interpretation of half your age plus 7, or prescriptive roles based explicitly on divine order where the age gap, particularly male seniority, must ideally be large enough to reinforce a specific authority structure, all the way over to systems like the therapeutic approach or liberal feminism that focus almost purely on the functional health, the psychological maturity, and the genuine power dynamics between the individual partners, largely setting aside prescribed roles or numbers.
What's fascinating here, I think, is really seeing how the definition of what constitutes an acceptable or problematic age disparity shifts entirely based on which system of value you prioritize.
Yeah.
If you prioritize individual choice and consent above all, you might accept a much wider gap between two clearly consenting, mature adults. If you prioritize material conditions and economic equality, like the Marxist lens, you look almost exclusively for wealth disparity as the key factor making a gap problematic.
Right.
And if you prioritize adherence to prescribed social or religious roles and a perceived divine or natural order, like the traditional Catholic source we examined, you may even require a noticeably large age difference to properly reinforce the intended structure of the relationship. The deep dive really shows that age is clearly functioning as a proxy for power, fertility, social status, and maturity. But which of those it signifies most strongly depends entirely on the framework you bring to the table.
This deep dive really hammers home that inherent complexity. The law can only manage the very basics of consent, that minimum threshold. Ideology provides the potent critique regarding social structures and power. But in reality, the psychological evidence synthesized here seems to show the truest risks are often tied to exploiting immaturity, creating dependency, and engaging in patterns of control, things that can persist long after the legal age of consent is technically crossed.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after this deep dive. We've analyzed a whole host of rules and frameworks, secular, sacred, clinical, ideological. If the most consistent concern that emerges across almost all these diverse viewpoints isn't really a specific number of years, but rather the pattern of one partner exclusively seeking out much younger partners, potentially to maintain control or exploit an imbalance.
That pattern concern was key, yes.
Then does modern society actually have adequate tools, beyond just the blunt instrument of the legal age of consent, to effectively define, identify, and maybe regulate those potentially manipulative or predatory patterns when both partners are legally adults? Or does the sheer complexity and incompatibility of all these competing frameworks simply mean that the legal age of consent, however imperfect, will always remain the only truly enforceable boundary in practice?
That's a tough question. Where does societal responsibility end and individual autonomy begin, especially when subtle coercion might be involved?
Something to think about, definitely, as we all navigate the often unwritten rules of relationships and power dynamics.
Indeed. Until next time, keep digging deeper.